best friends go to explore an abandoned zoo. They never imagined what they would find, with one of their own trapped and in danger. They must work together to save her from a crazy polar bear and a madman. But even after they are rescued, the nightmare is far from over. Join them as they navigate a world of danger, mystery, and unexpected twists that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Will they make it out alive? The four teenagers were looking for a thrill, and they thought they had found it in the abandoned zoo. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences in the old enclosures, and they were eager to investigate. As they made their way through the overgrown paths, they could feel the weight of the abandoned zoo bearing down on them. Everything was quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps on the cracked pavement. The first enclosure they came across was the monkey exhibit. The monkeys were gone, but the smell of feces still lingered in the air. The cages were rusted and broken, and the once bright paint was now chipped and faded. As they moved further into the zoo, the sense of unease began to grow. The sounds of rustling leaves and snapping twigs echoed through the enclosures, making them feel like they were being watched. The group came across an old ticket booth. The glass was shattered, and the ticket counter was covered in dust. They decided to take a break and catch their breath. They joked and laughed, trying to alleviate their nerves. As they were about to leave, one of the girls, Emily, noticed a small doorway at the back of the booth. She suggested that they take a look, curious about where it might lead. The others were hesitant, but they eventually agreed. The door creaked open, and they found themselves in a dark and narrow hallway. It was damp and smelled of mold. They followed the hallway, hoping to find something interesting, but the deeper they went, the more their fears grew. Suddenly, they heard a loud thud behind them. They turned around to see that the door had shut, trapping them inside. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. They were stuck. The darkness began to close in on them, and they could hear strange noises coming from the shadows. It sounded like whispers, and whispers turned into laughter. The laughter got louder, and they began to hear footsteps getting closer and closer. One of the girls, Samantha, screamed in terror, and as they turned around to comfort her, they realized that Emily was gone. They searched the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and they realized that they were not alone. The abandoned zoo was alive with danger, and they were trapped in its grip. As they tried to find a way out, they stumbled upon a room that looked like a makeshift laboratory. There were cages and tables covered in strange instruments, but what they saw in the cages made their blood run cold. Inside were twisted, grotesque versions of animals they recognized. They looked like experiments gone wrong, and they knew that they had stumbled upon something truly horrific. Suddenly, they heard Emily's voice coming from one of the cages. They rushed to it, but it was empty. They could hear her voice getting further and further away. They knew that they had to get out of there, but the question was, could they? As they approached the cage, the crazed polar bear lunged at them, and they had no choice but to fight. They used anything they could find as weapons, trying to fend off the bear while they worked to free Emily from the cage. In the struggle, the teenagers suffered minor injuries, cuts, and bruises, but they knew that their friend's life was at stake, and they pushed through the pain. However, just as they were about to free Emily, the smaller, crazed polar bear lunged again, this time knocking one of the teenagers to the ground. The others tried to save their friend, but the crazed polar bear was too strong, and it quickly overpowered them. As they struggled to fight it off, they watched in horror as the other, larger polar bear started to come around. They knew that they had to get out of there, but they couldn't leave without Emily. As they frantically searched for a way to save her, the polar bears closed in on them, and they could hear the sound of bones crunching as the crazed polar bear attacked their fallen friend. The remaining teenagers knew that they were no match for the polar bears, and they had no choice but to flee for their lives. They ran towards the exit, their hearts pounding with fear, and as they looked back, they could see the polar bears closing in on Emily. They knew that they had failed to save their friend, and as they stumbled out of the abandoned zoo, they were left with the haunting question of what had become of Emily. Weeks had passed since the harrowing incident at the abandoned zoo, but the memory of what happened continued to haunt the remaining teenagers. They couldn't shake off the guilt of leaving their friend Emily behind, and they knew they had to do something to make things right. After much discussion, They decided to go back to the zoo and search for Emily, armed with flashlights, ropes, and anything else they could use as a weapon. They cautiously made their way back to the zoo. The once vibrant and lively zoo now lay abandoned and silent. The only sounds were the occasional screech of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. They started by retracing their steps and quickly found the polar bear enclosure. The memory of the gruesome scene they had witnessed came flooding back to them as they surveyed the area. The enclosure was now empty, and there was no sign of Emily. They pressed on, searching every nook and cranny, calling out Emily's name in hopes of hearing a response. But there was only silence. As they explored the zoo, they came across a building they hadn't noticed before. It was a small, dingy building with peeling paint and a rusted sign that read Animal Hospital. They hesitated for a moment but decided to investigate. They pushed open the door, and the stench of decay and rot hit them like a wave. Inside, they found rows of cages, each containing the remains of various animals that had once been housed in the zoo. The sight was gruesome, and they felt sick to their stomachs. Suddenly, they heard a faint sound, a soft whimpering coming from a corner of the room. They followed the sound and found Emily, alive but barely. She was lying in a small cage, her clothes torn, and her skin covered in bruises and cuts. She looked up at them, her eyes wide with fear, and whispered, "Help me." They quickly worked to free her, and as they pulled her out of the cage, they heard the sound of footsteps coming towards them. They turned to see a man standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and empty. "Welcome to my zoo," he said with a sinister smile. "You're just in time for the grand tour." The teenagers realized with horror that they had stumbled upon the owner of the abandoned zoo, a madman who had been keeping animals captive and torturing them for years. They knew they had to get Emily out of there and get out of there themselves, but they were trapped. The man approached them slowly, and they could see that he was armed with a knife. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they refused to give up. They fought with all their might, using every weapon at their disposal, but the man was too strong. As they struggled, they could hear Emily's soft voice urging them to keep fighting, to not give up. But as they continued to battle, they knew that their chances of survival were slim. The sound of Emily's voice faded away as they fell to the ground, the man standing over them with his knife. The darkness closed in around them, and the last thing they heard was the man's cold laughter, knowing that they would never leave the abandoned zoo alive. As the man's laughter echoed through the abandoned zoo, the teenagers lay motionless on the ground. They thought that it was the end for them, that they were going to die there. But suddenly, they heard a loud noise that made the man turn his attention away from them. They looked up to see that a group of police officers had arrived, alerted by their worried families who had noticed they were missing for several hours. The man was surrounded, and after a short-lived fight, he was apprehended and taken away. The teenagers were taken to the hospital, where they received treatment for their injuries. Emily's condition was critical, and she had to be taken to the ICU, where she underwent surgery to repair her broken bones and internal injuries. The rest of the group, however, was released with minor cuts and bruises. After a few days, they were allowed to visit Emily, who was now stable and recovering. She was surprised to see them, and a wave of emotions hit her when they explained everything that had happened since they had left her in the zoo. They had come back to the zoo to look for her, and they had found her trapped in the animal hospital. The man had attacked them, but they had managed to hold him off until the police arrived. Emily was grateful to them, and they hugged and cried, promising to never leave each other's side again. The news of the man's arrest had made headlines, and people were shocked to hear what had been happening in the abandoned zoo. The authorities had launched an investigation, and they had found evidence that the man had been running the zoo illegally for years and had been torturing animals and keeping them in inhumane conditions. The zoo was shut down, and the remaining animals were taken to sanctuaries and zoos that could care for them. The teenagers were hailed as heroes, and they were recognized for their bravery by the authorities and the media. After the incident, the teenagers had a newfound appreciation for life and the importance of their friendships. They knew that they had been lucky to come out alive, and they promised to always stick together and look out for each other. As they left the hospital, they decided to take a walk in the park, and as they walked, they talked and laughed, grateful to be alive and together. They had been through a lot, but they had come out stronger than ever before. They looked forward to the future, knowing that they could overcome anything as long as they had each other.